Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned with how people are brewing with the most powerful cards available in the game. And cEDH is famous for starting its games with explosive bursts of mana ramp. We're talking about the metagame defined by Mana Crypt and Mox Diamond here. We've talked about the stages of the game, ready, set, go, in a previous video. This time, much of what we'll be talking about uses this model to discuss progressing from the getting ready stage to the all set up stage of the game. But before we do that, we should first define what we're talking about. We're going to distinguish between ramp and fixing. Fixing gives you access to more of a particular type of mana. A good example of the difference between ramp and fixing is the difference between Prophetic Prism and Mindstone. Both of these are artifacts which cost 2 generic mana. Mindstone can tap by itself for a colorless mana, so it ramps you without necessarily fixing you. Prophetic Prism, on the other hand, can fix any one generic mana into any one color of mana that you need, so it fixes you without getting you ahead in terms of ramp. Today, we're going to be focused almost exclusively on ramp. Fixing is going to have to be an episode all unto itself. The first piece to understand is that ramp can serve 3 purposes under our ready, set, go model. Number 1, ramp can provide the initial jump in mana needed to accelerate from the getting ready stage to the all set up stage. Number 2, we can use rituals to play an overpowered card much earlier than anticipated by trading away card advantage in order to do so. Number 3, massive ramp cards are going to enable us to have a significant boost in mana to the point where we no longer are constrained by mana as a resource in order to perform the game actions that we want to perform. Let's start our discussion today with what is your most important and honestly the most common form of ramp, that ramping from the getting ready stage to reach all set up. This is your cheap bread and butter ramp. In general, you want this ramp to be both plentiful and cheap in your deck list. You want to be able to consistently access this ramp and cast it before your metagame's critical turn. Rebel Sun has discussed in the past the concept of respecting that critical turn, and part of that includes making sure that your mana ramp is able to be cast in advance of the critical turn so you are ready to play and interact by the critical turn. This usually means that you are going to be able to multispell, or at least threaten to multispell, while both developing your game plan and having answers ready for your opponent's game plans by the time the critical turn rolls about. If you have to choose between developing your plan or answering your opponent's, you will fall behind. The importance of your early ramp being cheap and plentiful is to consider the concept of mana as a resource, not on a turn-by-turn basis, but over the course of an entire game. A turn 1 Soul Ring tapped each turn over the course of a game of 6 turns has provided you 12 additional mana above and beyond magic as Richard Garfield intended. It has been shown time and time again. The player who spends the most mana in a given game is the player most likely to win that game. When you're trying to decide what ramp counts as quote-unquote cheap, this should depend on your metagame's critical turn. If you are looking at a slower metagame where no one is really going for it before turn 4, impactful 3-mana ramp spells are still very much in consideration. Kodama's Reach in green will get you both excellent fixing as allow you to ramp while also technically replacing itself in your hand, albeit with just a basic land. The recently printed Cursed Mirror from C21 provides utility as both a clone effect, getting you a potential attacker and a powerful enter the battlefield effect, while then sticking around to act as a mana rock on later turns by tapping for red. The 3-mana value ramp spell seems to be where R&D are putting cards which provide both ramp, a modicum of fixing, and some additional benefit. We'll talk more about that later. If your metagame has a later critical turn, you can usually afford to run some of the 3-mana value ramp spells in order to play more impactful spells in your deck. Fast metagames like cEDH, however, have a critical turn closer to 2 or 2.5, so the 0 and 1 mana ramp spells are king here. In order to be ready for the critical turn, it's hard to justify the expense of higher mana value ramp, which leaves you stuck in the getting ready stage while your opponents are all set up. They may already even be going for it before you can even accelerate out of the getting ready stage if you're depending on 3 mana value ramp spells. Take into account things like your commander's mana value as well as the key cards in your game plan. These should also inform your choice of ramp spells. For example, Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons, has a mana value of 2, and much of her ramp package is going to revolve around 1 or 0 mana value spells in order to get her online as consistently as possible on turn 2, before opponents can muster blockers to defend against her. Looking at the deck list on the cEDH deck list database, for example, Hapatra Vizier of Poisons doesn't even run 2 mana value ramp spells. Since most decks are going to rely on their commanders as a key part of their strategy, getting access to your commander a turn or 2 early can be really helpful. The general rule of thumb is that playing a ramp spell with a mana value equal to your commander's mana value -2 will allow you to drop your commander a full turn early, assuming you're able to hit your land drops. Playing a ramp spell with a mana value equal to your commander's mana value -1, on the other hand, will allow you to drop your commander on time, so no real acceleration there, but it does still give you the option of having mana available for cheap development or cheap interaction on the turn you play your commander. Being able to hold up a cheap counterspell like Swan Song to protect your commander being cast, or being able to hold up a piece of removal, such as Swords to Plowshares, can be extremely helpful if you're casting your commander into the critical turn, and you want to be able to interact with your opponents. Outside of simply using ramp to get to where you need to go, to reach that all set up stage, we can also look at rituals. This is a part of the metagame which has really been evolving in cEDH, the use of rituals to catapult ahead of your opponents. And the recent printing of Jeweled Lotus in Commander Legends has brought the question of when it's right to play this card to non-cEDH tables as well. Essentially, you're going to be trading away card advantage by burning a card to get the ritual effect in order to access a resource that you normally would need several more turns in order to access. In the case of Jeweled Lotus, this means getting your commander potentially as many as 3 turns earlier than usual. This category of effects is named after Dark Ritual, the iconic spell from all the way back in Alpha, turning 1 black mana into 3 black mana. This has been iterated upon a few times with effects like Culling the Weak and Cabal Ritual, before it migrated to Red Share of the Color Pie, with effects like Brightstone Ritual, Seething Song, and Desperate Ritual. This also includes so-called brown rituals, mana-producing artifacts like Mana Vault or Grim Monolith, which tap for more mana than they cost to cast, but then require a payment of mana to untap, making them effectively a one-time use effect without a hefty investment of resources at a later time. Our lesson from cEDH here is that rituals can be very effective when you can use the mana from them to go for it, or to position yourself far ahead of your opponents during the all-set-up stage. In cEDH, an entire archetype of decks are built around using rituals from black and red to cast an early ad nauseum, and really go for it before the other decks are likely to have any good early interaction. We can apply this outside of cEDH by planning to power out powerful mid-range value engines before our opponents can play around them, or very powerful creatures in order to take over the board. Imagine a Boros deck with a critical mass of rituals designed to power out value engines like Smothering Tithe as early as turn 2. Nobody is going to be able to realistically pay 2 on turns 2 and 3, while you are leapfrogging ahead of everyone with the treasures that you're accumulating. A turn 2 Seedborn Muse in a Golgari deck, off of the back of a Dark Ritual and a Dork, can set us up way ahead of our opponents to play a highly interactive game plan, or dump mana into a mana sink, which every single turn lets us grind out additional value. Now, not every deck has access to a critical mass of rituals needed to make this a reliable part of their game plan, but if your deck does, and you have a consistent plan for where to dump that mana, this is something that's worth considering. Let's move on to the third and final category of ramp, and this is your massive ramp. The ramp you use to close out the game when you are really going for it. Think of massive ramp as the effect where you get to say, mana is no longer the limiting factor to the game actions that I am going to take. In cEDH, these are your infinite mana combos, like Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal. Outside of cEDH, when we're at more casual tables, this could include effects like Boundless Realms, catapulting you from 7 mana to 14. Massive Ramp usually does very little to help you accelerate from getting ready to all set up. Massive Ramp's job is just to help you go for it. As a result, you often need much less Massive Ramp in your deck in order for it to be effective. You really don't want to see Massive Ramp early on when you don't have any way to make use of it, and it sits stranded as a dead card in your hand. In decks with an outlet to spend infinite mana, such as cEDH decks which run Thrasios as a partner, it's a powerful win condition. If your deck lacks any real use for that massive amount of mana, it's often just win more to use Boundless Realms to go from 7 to 14 mana, or even to get a card like Nyx Bloom Ancient into play. These cards can provide an unbelievable spike in your mana, but if you don't have anything to do with it, if you're playing a low-to-the-ground elf deck where most of your spells cost 1 or 2 mana, and you are expecting to have a low number of cards in your hand, you may not have anything to do with all that mana. It's essentially a ramp to nowhere. This means not every deck really needs to have massive ramp in order to close out the game. Your endgame plan may not include massive ramp, and that is perfectly acceptable. You may have an entirely different game plan, which does not rely on unbounded or massive amounts of mana to end things. These massive ramp spells can be cards you may want to cut from your list in favor of more efficient pieces of ramp if you find you're not getting caught up on the critical turn, or you simply find that they linger in your hand without any real utility. Now that we've discussed our 3 categories of ramp, where does that leave our other forms of ramp, the ones trapped in the middle? Especially in low color decks, we sometimes lack the redundancy of ramp pieces needed to fit what we're looking for in terms of early game ramp. As an example, if we're looking at 2 mana value ramp spells, if we're in a 2-color deck, we have access to Arcane Signet, Fellwar Stone, our Guild Signet, and Talisman. That is 4 pieces of 2 mana value ramp. Meanwhile, 3-color decks get access to the same Arcane Signet and Fellwar Stone, but they also get access to 3 Guild Signets and 3 Talismans, doubling their total amount of mana rocks available at the 2 mana value slot from 4 in a 2-color deck to 8 in a 3-color deck. This discrepancy often means that low-colored decks are really going to be scraping to find the cards they need to hit their critical mass of ramp early in the game. Decks which dip into green as part of their color identity can use mana dorks as well as land ramp like Nature's Lore or Rampant Growth in order to round out their ramp package. Monocolor decks have it even tougher, often needing to dip into colorless mana ramp, which does not provide any fixing at all, just in order to keep up with their opponents. Once you've maxed out that efficient early ramp package, it's time to get a little bit more lenient and fill out your ramp package with more expensive or less impactful sources of ramp. It's not ideal, but having the redundancy is really that important. You may wind up going shields down on the critical turn sometimes, but it's honestly better than going shields down on that turn and then turns after the critical turn as well, while you are struggling to catch back up with your opponents. In general, the design principle from Wizards of the Coast seems to be that the 3 mana value rock or other ramp spell will tap for any color of mana, providing you good fixing, and then provide a small upside as well. This means cards like Manalith and Darksteel Ingot are frankly no longer in consideration for most decks. Meanwhile, the going rate for a 2 mana value rock at this point is ramp with no fixing, usually tapping for a single colorless mana with a tiny upside. The iconic card here is something like Mindstone, a 2-mana artifact which taps for a single colorless mana, or you can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice it to draw a card. A small amount of colorless ramp with a modest upside. When you have exhausted the more efficient mana rocks and ramp spells that you need to make your deck work before the critical turn, and you are now forced to look at less efficient cards, it's time to look for the more expensive ramp, which at least synergizes with your deck's overall game plan. If you're playing a landfall deck, Cultivate and Kadama's Reach are going to help you hit those landfall triggers on a regular basis. Our subsequent visits to Ravnica gave us both Guild Cluestones and then Guild Lockets as 3 mana value rocks. While not ideal, they can still tap for both colors of mana in the Guild's color identity, and they can later be cashed in to draw a card. Quite frankly though, Commander's Sphere is likely better than either of those. If we're really reaching, we may want to include all of them, but Commander's Sphere does not require a mana investment for us to cash it in later for a card. Coalition Relic is a classic which is still useful for us to be able to bank mana away for our next turn, while still holding it up to threaten interaction until the last possible second before our turn begins. Cards like Heraldic Banner from Throne of Eldraine can also be useful in go-wide low-color decks. It provides a modicum of ramp and fixing, and also provides a small Anthem effect. That about does it for this lesson from cEDH. We want to hear from you next. How do you pick the ramp for your deck? What goes into your decision making with it? Do you have any spicy ramp cards which really turn heads every time you cast them at your tables? We want to hear about it. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG. You can send us an email at gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and please, if you found anything here helpful, it really helps to share it with your friends. Until next time, I'm John, this is Gemstone Mine, and remember to ramp responsibly.